For God's sake, make him stop. The voice rang sharp from across the fence. Mrs. Tillman, hands on her hips, bathrobe flapping in the wind like she was defending her property from an invading army. Her eyes, narrowed with irritation, were fixed on the dog in the corner of the backyard. A young mutt, half Labrador, half something that ran through bramble for sport, dusty brown coat, white-socked paws. He had dug a hole nearly 2 feet deep, right along the base of the old maple tree. Again, Diesel, enough. Joanna pressed the screen door open with her shoulder and jogged down the steps. Her tone was firm, but not angry. She didn't have it in her to be angry anymore. Diesel paused, panting, face covered in loose soil, tail wagging like he'd just discovered treasure. He looked at her with that wild mix of mischief and urgency that only dogs possess, like he was trying to communicate something far beyond the vocabulary of barks. Mrs. Tillman muttered something under her breath about rescues, with no manners, and disappeared back into her house, slamming the sliding door just hard enough to make a point. Joanna barely noticed. She was already kneeling in the dirt beside Diesel, running her hands over his ears. "I just filled this in yesterday," she whispered. "Why this spot? What are you looking for?" Diesel whimpered, low and throaty, then dug again to more frantic swipes of his paws. She pulled him back gently, her hand brushing something beneath the churned soil. At first it felt like a root, but roots didn't feel soft or shaped. She froze. A small piece of faded cloth was barely visible, its edges stuck in the earth like forgotten laundry. She swallowed and moved the soil aside with her fingers. Careful now. Something about the moment had shifted. The air had gone still. Diesel sat beside her, unmoving for once, as if he understood when her fingertips struck the curve of something hard, something smooth and round. Beneath the fabric she knew. She called 911. Her hands trembled, but her voice stayed even. Training, instinct, trauma sharpens the senses in strange ways. She gave the address, explained what she found, and then sat back on the grass while Diesel pressed against her side, anchoring her. The backyard filled with red and blue light by nightfall. Police cars, unmarked vehicles, a coroner's van parked without sound. They worked quickly but respectfully, cordoning off the tree and setting up floodlights. An officer she didn't recognize approached her with a notepad and gentle eyes. His name tag read H. Ramirez. "Miss Langley, you said you've lived here how long?" 3 months, Joanna replied. "I moved in late winter. No construction, no renovations that might have disturbed the yard." She shook her head. "I cleared some brush, filled holes. That's it." Ramirez nodded, scribbling. "And the dog. He's yours. I adopted him a week after moving in. From the shelter just off Highway 6. They didn't know much. Just that he was found wandering the old train yard, malnourished, scared of men. But he followed me when I walked in." She gave a shaky breath. "I didn't pick him, he picked me." Ramirez didn't speak for a moment. Then he looked past her, toward the excavation now forming under the maple. "Your dog just helped solve something, maybe something long buried." Joanna didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on Diesel, who was still sitting quietly, ears raised, gaze focused on the tree, as if he were waiting for something or someone to be found. The body was small, wrapped in flannel, bones long, dry but intact. A child. Number 2. Identification. Just a stuffed toy, sun-bleached and threadbare, clutched to the chest like a final act of comfort. Joanna went inside when they brought it out. She didn't want Diesel to see, not because he couldn't handle it, because she couldn't. The next morning, reporters knocked, cameras hovered, headlines twisted, remains found in backyard of widow's new home. Rescue dog uncovers mystery in small-town suburb. Joanna ignored them all. She closed the curtains and curled into the couch while Diesel lay at her feet, his tail still, eyes wide open. She hadn't cried in a long time. Not since Brian's accident, but that morning she wept. Not loud, not desperate, just the kind of cry that sits in the throat too long and finally breaks free when no one is watching. Diesel moved toward her then, pressing his forehead against hers, and for the first time since they'd met, he whimpered not with urgency but with empathy, like he was telling her it was okay to feel it. That grief recognized grief. Later that week, Ramirez returned with news. Dental records matched a missing child case from 17 years ago. A girl named Lily Brennan disappeared from her yard 3 towns over. No suspects, no leads. Her mother had died 5 years ago. Her father was never found. They'd been living in a rental at the time, the same property Joanna had bought when Ramirez left. Joanna sat on the back steps, staring at the tree. Diesel lay beside her, calm, watching. She reached over, fingers grazing the soft fur between his ears. "You brought her home," she whispered. Diesel didn't move. He just stayed there, a quiet sentinel beside the only person who had ever listened. The backyard didn't feel like hers anymore. Joanna stood at the edge of the porch with her arms crossed tightly against her chest, staring at the rectangle of disturbed soil beneath the tree. The police had filled it back in, laid down a tarp, and marked it with tape, but nothing about it could be unseen now. The grass around it was trampled, muddy from the weight of boots and equipment. Diesel paced slowly in a circle around the tree, stopping occasionally to sniff the ground as if trying to understand why the air had changed. She hadn't slept. The headlines kept multiplying. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing calls from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Reporters hungry for an angle, and well-meaning neighbors who suddenly remembered her name now that it was connected to a buried child. Joanna declined every interview. She didn't want her face on camera. She didn't want to be part of the narrative. The only thing that kept her grounded was Diesel. Every time she felt herself slipping, he was there leaning against her leg, nudging her hand, pressing his weight into her when the grief came fast and tight. It had started happening again. The panic attacks, the shortness of breath, the sensation that the walls were closing in. They hadn't come since the first year after Brian's death, but the discovery in the yard had torn something open inside her, something raw. Late one evening, as she tried to fold laundry that didn't matter, Officer Ramirez called. "We traced the rental records," he said. "Turns out Lily Brennan's family didn't own the home, same as you suspected. It was in the name of a company, Shell LLC. No real paper trail." Joanna sat down slowly. Someone tried to make her disappear completely. "Looks that way. Did you find the father?" Still no sign, no death certificate, no activity. He vanished just months after Lily did. The mother filed the missing persons report, but nothing ever stuck. He was never charged, never located. Joanna stared out the window, her throat tight. Diesel found her. After all those years, that child was just there, waiting. "We don't know how," Ramirez said quietly, "but it's likely someone moved her. The forensics team suspects the body had been there less than 3 years, which means she wasn't buried when it happened. Correct?" Joanna's hand curled into a fist. Someone had relocated Lily's body, chained to guilt, or burying the evidence before dying themselves. The questions spiraled, but none of them led anywhere solid. When she hung up, Diesel was sitting in front of the sliding glass door, eyes fixed on the darkened yard. She opened the door and followed him outside. The wind was sharp, the air damp. Diesel walked to the tree and sat beside it, not pawing now, not digging, just watching. Joanna crouched beside him. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew she didn't belong there. It wasn't just instinct. There was something in the way he had refused to let that spot go. Some dogs bark, some bolt." Diesel had dug steadily, deliberately, until someone listened. The next morning, Joanna went back to the shelter where she had adopted him. She hadn't returned since the day she walked out with him on a frayed leash. The building smelled the same, like antiseptic and damp floors and stale biscuits. A volunteer at the desk looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'm trying to find Diesel's intake records," she said. "The dog I adopted in February. Brown mutt, white feet, shelter tag 1183. The woman typed into her computer, then frowned. "You know, he wasn't here long. He was brought in by a local man. No paperwork. Said he found the dog wandering near the train yard. That's all we have. No chip, no history." Joanna hesitated. "Do you know the man's name?" "Didn't leave one, but I remember him. Looked tired. Maybe mid-50s. Said the dog kept coming back to the same lot near a vacant house." Joanna blinked. "What house?" The woman leaned closer, checked the record again. "1 second. She disappeared into the back, then returned with a small intake form. "It says the lot was on Laurel Street, East Side." Joanna froze. Laurel Street had been in the news a few years back, a property that had burned down under suspicious circumstances. The address clicked in her memory. She pulled out her phone, searching articles until she found it. The house that had burned belonged to Lily Brennan's mother. Joanna stepped back, the air thinning. Diesel hadn't just found Lily, that had followed her somehow. In his own way, this dog had connected dots that no one else had. He had returned to the one place where someone had mourned that child, and when that place vanished in fire, he came here, to the last place she'd been hidden that night. Joanna lit a candle beside her kitchen window and placed it in front of a photo, one she had printed after the report was made public. A photo of Lily Brennan, a child with missing teeth and tangled hair, and the kind of smile only kids still untouched by the world can wear. Diesel sat at her feet as she lit the flame. "You brought her back," she said. "You wouldn't stop until someone listened." He didn't look at her. He just stared at the candle, the glow catching in his eyes. And for the first time since she buried her husband, Joanna didn't feel like she was carrying the weight of silence alone. Joanna didn't tell anyone about Laurel Street, not yet. She needed more than instinct and burned memories. The threads were there: Diesel's appearance, the missing child, the destroyed home. But speculation wouldn't hold up in a world where people demanded answers carved in stone. She needed truth, not just connection. Still, she couldn't let it go. She kept replaying what the shelter workers said about the man who brought Diesel in. No name, no address, only that he'd looked tired, like someone near the edge of giving up. She spent the next few days driving. Not aimlessly, she followed the trail backward, one town at a time, asking quiet questions, pressing her luck with a charm she hadn't used since before Brian's accident. She started near the train yard where Diesel had first been found. The property had long been abandoned, overgrown and forgotten by anyone who hadn't lived through its noise. But tucked behind the crumbling fence was a mobile trailer, sun-faded and rusted along the seams. There were signs of life. An old truck parked nearby. smoke curling weakly from a vent pipe. Joanna knocked. The man who answered didn't speak at first. Late 50s, heavy-set, grizzled. He looked at her like she was a problem he didn't expect to deal with. But when she showed him a photo of Diesel, something in his face cracked. "You, his new person?" he asked, voice rough like gravel. Joanna nodded slowly. "He led me to her." The man stepped back and led her inside without another word. The trailer smelled like tobacco and old motor oil. On the table, stacked beneath yellowed newspapers, were photos, some of dogs, some of empty fields. One frame held a picture of a young girl standing beside a man in uniform. The girl was unmistakable. Lily Brennan. The man sat down heavily. "I didn't kill her," he said before she could ask. "I just didn't know how to save her." Joanna remained standing. Her heartbeat sounded louder than it should have. "She was my niece. My sister had her too young, got tangled up with a man who made rules with his fists. When Lily went missing, I knew where to look, but by the time I found the body, her mother had already fallen apart. She thought she could bury the truth and live with it. But then she burned it all down. And He stopped, rubbed a shaking hand across his face. "I took what was left and moved her, tried to bury her properly. That's all I could do." Joanna's voice was steady, but her hands were clenched. "Why didn't you call the police?" He laughed, bitter and hollow. "And say what? That I moved a body I found 5 years too late. That I kept quiet to protect a sister already lost in grief and guilt." He looked at her then, eyes red. "I didn't do right by Lily, but I couldn't let her rot where no one would remember her, so I moved her. Found a yard no one cared about. I didn't know someone would move in." Joanna didn't speak. She didn't need to. There was nothing she could say that would untangle the sadness that filled the small space around them. "She loved dogs," he added quietly, used to say she'd grow up to rescue all the stray ones. "When I saw him, Diesel kept returning to the spot where I buried her. I thought maybe she sent him, or maybe he remembered the scent of sorrow." Joanna drove home in silence. The grief in that trailer had folded in on itself so many times it no longer looked like grief. It looked like a man barely keeping his regrets from eating him alive. When she returned, Diesel was waiting at the door, tail thumping once before settling. She knelt in front of him, hands on either side of his face. "You didn't just find her," she whispered. "You followed her. You stayed. You waited." That night she called Ramirez and told him everything, not to exonerate the man entirely, but to explain the unexplainable. The timeline, the relocation, the silence. She left out nothing. By morning, investigators were en route to the trailer. 2 days later, Ramirez returned to her door. "We verified what he said. The timeline, the family connection, the fact that he tried to report domestic abuse years ago. He did. It just never went anywhere." His voice was heavier than usual. "He won't be charged for moving the body. We're treating it as an act of conscience, not concealment." Joanna exhaled. "Slowly, but what he gave us." Ramirez paused. "We reopened the case officially, and we're tracing back to Lily's father." Joanna didn't ask where he was. She didn't need to. Instead, she walked out to the yard. The snow had melted almost completely now, leaving the ground soft, uneven. A single tree stood in the corner, its roots pushing through the earth, its presence oddly dignified. She laid her hand against the bark and closed her eyes. She'd once thought moving here was an accident, a desperate decision made in the middle of grief. But now, she wondered if something had pulled her not just toward the house, but toward the dog who refused to let the truth stay buried. Diesel lay beneath the tree, watching her, still calm, as if he knew his work wasn't done, but his part was. He had dug not for bones, not for attention, but for something deeper, to bring her to the story that needed telling, and to remind the world that silence doesn't erase what's been done. It just delays the reckoning, and that reckoning had finally begun. The yard looked different now. Not physically, there were still muddy tracks and the faded tape fluttering from the branches, but in feeling. Joanna no longer saw the overgrown corner of her property as an accident of fate. She saw it as a turning point where silence was replaced with truth, where one girl, forgotten by the system, was remembered not by paperwork or press, but by a dog who refused to give up. Diesel had stopped digging. Completely, he'd no longer circled the tree or scratched at the base like something was pulling him downward. Instead, he laid near the trunk, quiet, watchful, as if his part in the story had reached its end. Joanna didn't disturb him. She'd come to trust that his instincts weren't noise, they were the thread pulling something buried back into the light. Still, peace hadn't returned. Not entirely. The investigation into Lily's death had taken a sudden turn. Ramirez called 2 days after their last meeting. His voice, normally calm and measured, held something sharper this time. "We found something in the forensics report, buried with Lily." Joanna stood in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, heart caught mid-beat. It wasn't just the stuffed toy. There was something inside the fabric, a small ziplock taped inside the lining. "What was it?" she asked, barely whispering. "A silver chain, children's size. On it was a charm, the initial K engraved on one side. On the back, a date." Joanna gripped the counter, whose date. Ramirez paused. "It matches the day your husband died." Joanna felt the ground shift beneath her. She had never told Ramirez the exact date, not aloud. The obituary had left it vague. but she knew it like a scar. May 12, 3 years ago. Brian's motorcycle hit by a drunk driver just after midnight. That chain, sealed into the toy, had been buried with a child who disappeared 17 years ago. That can't be right, she said. That doesn't make sense. I agree, Ramirez said carefully, but that's what we're trying to understand. Later that night, she pulled out the box where she kept Brian's things. There wasn't much. His badge, a watch that hadn't worked in years, a photograph of the two of them, younger, standing in front of a beach that didn't exist anymore. She stared at the image for a long time. It had been her anchor, but now it felt like something else. A question. She had loved Brian. That wasn't in doubt, but grief changes people, and memory has a way of softening sharp edges. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something had never quite lined up in those final months. Brian had become withdrawn, edgy, short-tempered. He said it was work stress, but he had started taking long drives without explanation, returning silent. And then the accident. No note, no conversation, just the sudden, cruel finality of loss. But now, the next morning, she returned to the trailer. The man Lily's uncle was gone. The truck, the photos, the table strewn with newspapers all cleared out. A neighbor said he'd packed everything up just after sunrise. Joanna drove back home, pulse racing. She needed answers, but they kept slipping through her fingers. The photo of the charm haunted her. It wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. 2 hours later, Ramirez showed up on her doorstep. He didn't wait for an invitation. He held a manila envelope in his hand, and his face said everything before his mouth opened. There's more. Joanna led him inside. They sat across from each other at the dining table, the one she hadn't used since moving in. Diesel lay under her chair, ears alert but still. The Ziploc bag, Ramirez said. We ran it through analysis. It had trace DNA on the tape consistent with a male adult. No match in any existing system. But the style of packaging, it was identical to an evidence bag from a cold case storage unit. Joanna blinked. What kind of case? Ramirez opened the envelope and pulled out a photocopy. It was a report, owed, creased, scanned. The handwriting at the bottom caught her eye. It was familiar. The handwriting matches your husband's case notes, Ramirez said gently. The bag was part of a set issued to homicide investigators in this district over a decade ago. Most were discontinued, except for one batch signed out by Brian Langley. Joanna's mouth went dry. You think he knew? I think he found something. Maybe too late. Maybe he didn't know what to do with it. Maybe he didn't want you involved. She stood slowly, unsure whether her legs would hold her. So, you're saying Brian found her, or found evidence, and instead of reporting it, he buried it, or he tried to protect someone? We don't know. Not yet. The air in the room thickened. Diesel stood now, his body tense. Joanna walked to the window. Outside, the trees swayed in the wind. The place where everything started. She had come here to start over, to rebuild, to escape the shadows of loss. But maybe the truth was that Brian had come here first. Maybe he had been trying to make something right in the only way he knew how. She turned back to Ramirez. If he did this to protect her, to bring her home quietly, then maybe it was his final act of good. Joanna didn't cry. Not then. There was too much left to uncover. But that night, she buried something of her own. She took Brian's badge and placed it beneath the tree. Just the badge. No words, no plaque, just the weight of who he had been, and who she hoped he had tried to be. Diesel stood beside her, unmoving. Whatever came next, they would face it, because sometimes the truth doesn't just rise from the dirt. Sometimes it's been waiting patiently for someone brave enough to dig. By the time the final report came through, spring had already begun to take root in the yard. The maple tree had started to bud, and the last traces of winter were retreating into shadow. Joanna read the report, alone at the kitchen table, her fingertips resting on the pages without turning them. The conclusions were delicate, as if the investigators themselves weren't ready to speak in absolutes. Brian Langley had accessed records relating to Lily Brennan's disappearance a year before his death. He had checked out a series of files, including one marked as unrelated and long closed. He had visited Laurel Street twice in the 6 months before the accident. The report stopped short of naming him directly in connection with the burial, but the implications were clear. He had known. Maybe not the full story, maybe not who did what, but he had uncovered enough to act. Enough to take the truth quietly, painfully, and place it somewhere it might one day be found. Joanna didn't know if he buried the charm or simply found it and chose to keep it close, but he had touched it, wrapped it, left it with Lily as if trying to say, someone remembers you. And then, for reasons she might never fully understand, he left it behind without saying a word to the one person who would have stood beside him no matter the cost. Joanna folded the report and slipped it into the drawer where she kept the obituary, clippings, and Daniel's last letter from the force. She didn't need to reread it. The facts were no longer what mattered. What mattered now was what she chose to do with what remained. Diesel had been watching her from the hallway, his chin resting on his paws. He stood when she moved, his gait calm and sure, and followed her outside without needing a word. The grass was uneven beneath their feet, soft from days of rain. Joanna walked to the base of the tree and sat in the dirt, legs crossed, back resting against the trunk. Diesel curled up beside her, close enough to feel his warmth, his breath, his quiet understanding. She stayed there until the wind picked up, until the sunlight shifted from gold to deep amber. And then, without ceremony, she pulled the silver charm from her pocket and tied it to a thin branch overhead with a length of old thread. The letter K faced the sky, spinning gently in the breeze. She didn't say anything out loud. She didn't need to. The story was over. Not in the dramatic way people imagined. There had been no courtroom confessions, no final confrontation. Just a girl who was gone too soon, a man who had tried in his flawed, secretive way to bring her home, and a dog who had refused to let her be forgotten. A week later, Ramirez stopped by. He didn't bring a file or ask questions. He just came to sit on the porch with a thermos of coffee and a silence that fit. He watched Diesel roll lazily in the grass and finally spoke. "He's different. He found peace," Joanna said. Once the truth was out, he didn't need to carry it anymore. Ramirez nodded. "Dogs know things. Not the way we do, but better, sometimes." She didn't disagree. They sat for a while, watching the world move. A mail truck passed. Wind chimes on the neighbor's porch clinked softly, the kind of normal no one notices unless they've lived through chaos. Ramirez stood after a while. Before leaving, he paused. "There's talk about a plaque for Lily. The town's considering adding a memorial near the old school she would have attended." Joanna nodded. "She deserves more than memory. We're also thinking of recognizing Diesel. He wouldn't care about that," she said, smiling faintly. "But I'll frame it for him anyway." That night, she opened the notebook she'd stopped using after Brian's death. It had been full of plans, once vacations they never took, renovations they never finished, names of kids they'd never have. She turned to a blank page and started writing. Not a story, not a letter, but something simpler. Sometimes the loudest voices come from those who never speak. Sometimes the ones we lose leave behind maps, even if they don't know it. And sometimes a dog doesn't just dig up the past, he delivers it, patiently, gently, until someone is ready to carry it forward. She closed the notebook and placed it beside the windowsill. Outside, Diesel lay in the yard beneath the tree, head resting on his paws, the charm still spinning above him like a soft bell. And for the first time since she'd moved into the house, Joanna felt like it was hers, not because it was quiet but because it had told its story, and finally it had been heard.